Hi, my name is David Hitchcock. I'm an instructor with the Avant Media Institute, and today we're going to talk about cables, cable maintenance, and gaff tape. The first kind of cable we're going to talk about today is the instrument cable. This is one of the most widely used cables on the market. They are 1/4-inch cables, which means the tip is a 1/4 inch thick. There are a number of different types of 1/4-inch cables, and we'll get into that here in a minute, but the instrument cable is an unbalanced cable. It is designed with a wire running through it and then a shield running around it, and the circuit goes through the wire and returns down the shield. The important part of an instrument cable is, however, that it is shielded thickly. The signal being sent from an instrument is actually rather low. You would think something coming out of an electric guitar would be very hot, but that's not the case. You can even send line level signals through an instrument cable via a keyboard or perhaps a DJ controller. But the main thing is that the signal is protected, because outside interference attaching itself to that low of a signal will get amplified along with the rest of the signal at its destination. Next, we're going to talk about XLR cables. XLR cables can sometimes also be called mic cables or microphone cables. XLR cables are going to have 3 pins on one side, known as the male side, and then you're going to have 3 holes to receive the pins on the other side, or the female side. Now, of course, you can have XLR cables that are male to male or female to female, and you might confuse those for DMX cables, which are used in lighting. They're similar, and actually XLR cables can be used in lighting as well, though that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. An XLR cable is a balanced cable. You have 3 pins, so you have a send, a return, and then you have a ground pin also. They are also shielded cables, and the level of signal flowing through them is actually even lower than that of a line level signal. XLR cables can also be converted into TRS cables, which is a type of 1/4-inch cable. So a tip ring sleeve cable is a balanced cable, and you also have a send, a return, and then a ground. A tip ring sleeve cable can actually have an XLR connector on the other end. They function so incredibly similarly. The difference, of course, is the connection. Now it's time to talk about speaker cables. At first glance, a speaker cable could easily be mistaken for an instrument cable. After all, they're both tip sleeve and not tip ring sleeve, and 1/4-inch. There are some incredibly significant distinctions between instrument cables and speaker cables though, and you should not use one in place of the other. An instrument cable was designed to carry a low-level signal over distance to an amplifier. A speaker cable was designed to carry an amplified signal over distance to a speaker. Carrying an amplified signal over an instrument cable could melt the wiring inside and even cause a short circuit on the other end. You could quite literally start the fire. We don't want to make that mistake. Similarly, if you were to plug a speaker cable into an instrument, you wouldn't have to worry about setting things on fire, but a speaker cable is unshielded, whereas an instrument cable is shielded. So that low-level signal passing through from the instrument could be much more easily interrupted by an outside source. Speaker cables are built at different gauges. The quality of materials in speaker cables also matter, but that matters more the longer the cable you get. If you're at a 10 gauge cable, you can get a long cable so long as it's decently built without much signal loss. If you're at a 16 gauge speaker cable, you won't be able to take that signal very far without experiencing some signal loss, particularly on the high end. A 12 gauge cable can carry a signal up to 25 feet with only about 1% signal loss, which is pretty good. And it's worth noting that that 1% is not spread evenly over the signal. It's going to be distributed unevenly more towards the high signals, as those high frequencies will be affected by impedance more. As I mentioned before, there are TRS cables. That's known as tip ring sleeve. TRS cables are also balanced cables. We have 2 wires that are sending signal internally, separated by about 180-degree phase. And then there is also shielding around the cable. The shield around this cable is not acting as a conductor, it is literally just shielding the cable from outside interference. Whereas the shield on an instrument cable is acting as a part of the circuit. TRS cables will commonly be found in use in home studios connecting to powered speakers and coming from audio interfaces. With the TRS cable, we want to avoid using that in place of a tip sleeve 1/4-inch cable. You can experience signal drop-off or perhaps even phasing issues to the point that the volume of the signal by the time it arrives through the cable has been significantly decreased. Next, we're going to talk about what are commonly referred to as Edison cables. You might be familiar with these cables as a computer power cable or a printer power cable. More specifically, you have an Edison male, which is your common American 2-prong and ground, and then you have an IEC female. IEC stands for International Electrotechnical Commission, and they actually have several different types of cables that they have standardized. It would be wise to familiarize yourself with these different cables, particularly if you're on a network running several different types of power. However, when somebody says Edison cable, they are referring to the IEC running to Edison mail. Now, there is a trick with Edison cables to solve a ground hum loop. The round pin in the cable is known as the ground pin, and as you can see here, it's been taken out. The reason for taking the ground cable out is to eliminate a ground hum in the circuit. So if you're hearing that familiar buzz in your recordings, this might be the last effort you can make to get that out of there. It is recommended not to do that. The ground in an electrical circuit exists so that if there's a short circuit, all the excess power finds its way to ground instead of back into the circuit. An important thing to note as a guitarist or bassist, if you have an amp head running into a cabinet, it is very important to use a speaker cable to make that connection. You have an amplified signal going out, that will melt your instrument cable. Now let's talk a little bit more about unbalanced cables versus balanced cables. Unbalanced cables have one wire and then one flow back through the shield. You literally have a send and a return, nothing else happening. What this means is any signal that interrupts that is just going to be right there in that same circuit. Once again, this is why so many unbalanced cables are so highly shielded. They're really trying to avoid any outside interference. Now, a balanced cable, whether we're talking about a TRS 1/4 inch cable or an XLR cable, is going to have two sends going back and forth inside of the cable, as well as the shield being a ground, but not actually carrying signal. These two sends are designed to be 180 degrees out of phase. Now, this won't affect the signal that you're intentionally sending, but any signal that comes in and interrupts is literally going to be out of phase and will be canceled, at least mostly canceled, depending on the quality of the cable. I know I've said this before, but please make sure you're using the right cable for the right circuit. Do not use an instrument cable in place of a speaker cable, as you could, in fact, burn the place down. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. It is not. If you use a speaker cable in place of an instrument cable, you could wind up with a lot of outside noise. It may not burn your studio to the ground, but it might burn your session to the ground. And then with a balanced cable, if you plug that into an unbalanced destination, you might lose half the signal. It really depends on the design of the circuit, both of the cable as well as the input and outputs you're plugging into, but it's best just to make sure we're using the right cable for the right task. A couple of other cable types that are worth knowing about are digital cables. We have ADAC cables, which came around in the 90s, and they let us transfer more than one single track over a cable. You could get up to 6 on them. There are also Ethernet cables, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Ethernet cables also transfer digital information. You can have a 5, 5E, or 6 Ethernet cable, each one being more capable than the last of transferring large loads of information. It's hard to talk about Ethernet cables without talking about Dante. Dante is a system made by a company called Audinate, and it's used to integrate several things, including audio and video. You've hardly been in a stadium or to a music festival without running into the effects of Dante's usage. Although there are other systems in play, we here at Avant do prefer Dante. You can, of course, get certified on your own, but if you would like help making it through your Dante certification, we do offer that here amongst our courses at Avant Media Institute. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you'd like to learn more on this subject, you can check out avantmediainstitute.com, where more resources are available to you. Have an awesome day.